So, starting our section on status organizing processes and expectation states. Some quick updates and reminders. Activity 4 will be graded by Wednesday. Most of you have already received your grade with a comment or two on the assignment, but I still have a few more to finish up grading. Your quiz 4, however, is now graded. So make sure to check that. A few of you reached out to me and said that for the fill in the blank part, you added quotation marks to a couple of them or accidentally misspelled a word. I went through and paid attention to that, and as I always do, but paid extra special attention, and made sure that if you misspelled something or added quotation marks, that you did in fact receive points for that if you submitted the correct answer. Um, so if there are any issues, if I didn't make that correction on your quiz, please let me know. I'll be happy to fix it immediately. Your activity 5 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. and make sure to watch the supplementary videos for this week. So, getting started on expectation states theory. So, one thing I want to point out about expectation states theory is that it's kind of the broad umbrella for all the different theories and concepts we're going to discuss in this section. It's the broad umbrella. All of it falls under expectation states theory. So keep that in mind. But this theory aims to explain how our preconceived notions about others based on their identities are the basis for status hierarchies in small groups. And so these identities could be social identities, they could be personal and role identities. So, again, it's aiming to explain how the meanings we attach to these different identities, again, personal, role, or social identities, how those preconceived notions, the meanings we attach to them, are the basis for these status hierarchies in small groups. And what that means is, with every small group, whether it's a small group, maybe a work group at school, maybe a group of employees, maybe like a friend group, even, there are these status hierarchies that emerge. Like there's always kind of someone who's the leader of the group who has the most influence. And so expectation states theory investigates this process, incorporating concepts of identity specifically. And as I'm sure you can tell, it's very much also based in symbolic interaction and the meanings we attach to things in our environment, including people, and these different indicators of identity. Another thing I'd like to point out is that while this theory has been applied to more macro processes and macro level status differences, it's not, the theory isn't necessarily designed to address more macro level issues. And of course, that's something we'll discuss next week when we go over some of the critiques of this, but it's not necessarily applicable in a macro sense. This theory, again, theories are tools. They're specifically designed to address very specific problems. One of the examples I give is like a screwdriver. Like all screwdrivers accomplish the same task, but some are like a flathead screwdriver and some are like a Phillips head screwdriver. And so they work on different types of screws, right? But they all accomplish the same thing. And so that's kind of like theories, particularly in the social sciences, is that they're designed for a specific purpose. So while there are many other theories that might discuss status hierarchies and how they form in groups, this is one way of approaching that from a sociological, social psychology perspective. So, expectation states theory seeks to explain the emergence of status hierarchies in situations where actors are oriented towards the accomplishment of a collective goal or task. So, that could be like maybe a group project, that could be accomplishing a task at work, that could be a variety of different things. Within friend groups, it can vary. It can be a short-term goal or a long-term goal. But when we talk about groups' orientations. They can be task oriented, and they could also be collectively oriented. And so, task oriented is when individuals are, when they are primarily motivated towards solving a problem. When a group is collectively oriented, individuals um, within that group, they consider it legitimate and necessary to take into account each other's contributions when completing the task. So, just to kind of break these down, more task oriented might be like, let's say for a class, you have a group project, but you're all graded individually. And so maybe the purpose of having a group is for you guys to bounce ideas off of each other, read each other's work, critique each other's work. And so you're working together as more of like a study group, um, but you're all graded individually. And so you all have to work together to accomplish this goal that you're accomplishing as a group. And there's really no pressures to, uh, what's what I'm looking for? There's no pressure. There's no pressure to um, distinguish people from one another in terms of their ability to contribute to the overall goal. As long as everyone is doing what they're supposed to do, it doesn't really matter what skills you have or your background, as long as you're working together as a group, because you're being graded individually. It really comes down to your own effort. But in order for this to work as a group, we all just have to do our own work, that we're all doing what we're supposed to do for this collective goal. And but in a group that's more collectively oriented, maybe that's where you have to like delegate tasks and really distinguish people from one another, um, in terms of what you anticipate the their ability would be to contribute to the group task. So let's say you have to do a group project, you have to write a paper and do a presentation, and um, someone's going to do the presentation, someone's going to do the research, someone's going to do the writing, someone's going to do, something else, but you're going to kind of delegate based on everybody's abilities. So these evaluations are based on two main criteria. And so, what's important to note is that expectations theory is an approach to understanding how people evaluate other people's competence in small task groups and the amount of credibility and influence they give them as a result. And so, the two criteria we use to evaluate others based on um, these different characteristics are: one, specific skills and abilities relevant to the task. So, that could be like prior experience or training related to the task at hand. So, again, for the group project where you have to delegate who does what. Maybe someone writes for the OCALI, so they're a really good writer. They're really good at expressing themselves through writing. So, okay, this person's going to do the writing because they have the training, the skills, the talent, the ability to do so. And so, this could relate to those personal and role identities. So, those and the skills and abilities that are um, associated with those personal and role identities, and specifically those that are relevant to the task at hand. The second criteria we use to evaluate others are characteristics associated with perceived superiority. So this are characteristics such as gender, age, race, education, and physical attractiveness. And so these are really there are many more examples for the second set of criteria. But in the research, typically these are the factors that are most focused on, so that being gender, age, race, education, and physical attractiveness. So these things that really don't have any meaning in terms of the task, like someone's ability to complete a particular task, like physical attractiveness or race in particular, and gender. Like I can't even think of a situation where those would be relevant to completing any of the tasks um, I've used as an example. And so they're not relevant to the task, but it's a way of distinguishing people within the group, and the meanings that we attach to these things. And, do we give higher status to some groups over others? And so, again, these are perceived, these characteristics associated with perceived superiority. or at least higher status. And so, some three key points I want to hone in on here. So, the shared focus of group members on the group's goal, so that collective orientation, generates a pressure to anticipate the relative quality of each member's contribution to completing the task and in order to decide how to act. So, what that means essentially is you are evaluating members of the group in relation to one another. So, in terms of writing ability, you might draw on personal and role identities as well as social identities. Like, let's say, who's going to do the writing? Okay, there's a handful. There's two people in the group who are really good at speaking and articulating their ideas and expressing themselves, and one of them writes for the Okali. Okay, so one of your personal identities is like you speak very well, you're very good at expressing yourself, and then you also write. One of your role identities is you write for the Okali. So this person seems like they would be best at doing the write ups for the group. And so you're evaluating that person in relation to others, like who, considering these different identities, who would best suit um, this task? How would each person be able to best contribute based on these things? And each of those, of course, affords a different amount of status within the group and a different amount of influence. So, like maybe the person who is doing the delegating of tasks or the person who is doing like a lot of the research, they may be seen as more knowledgeable and more competent, more capable. And so they are more likely to have greater influence within the group. And other group members, when they anticipate that this person will make more valuable contributions, they will likely defer to this individual. Um, and these implicit anticipations, so you could just say these expectations, these assumptions we make that are often unconscious. We're not like actively weighing these things in our mind, at least for the most part, we aren't. But these implicit anticipations of the relative quality of members' performance are called performance expectation states. So when we're taking these things into consideration, these different identities, the skills that people can offer to the group, and these characteristics that are often unrelated to the task at hand, when we are taking into consideration these things, we're forming judgments and assumptions about how well a person will perform and what they will be able to contribute to the group, as well as the value of their contribution. And by that, I mean maybe the person who's doing all the writing has higher status than the person who is um, maybe just doing the reference page. I don't know. But probably has higher status and greater influence within that group because they're making a more valuable contribution, or at least we expect that their contribution will be more valuable. And so, again, just to reiterate, um, expectation states theory. It explains why social hierarchies emerge in these small task oriented groups. And that comes from both known information and implicit assumptions based on status characteristics. And this results in the evaluations of someone's ability to contribute to the task at hand, which again, not just their ability to contribute, but what contribution they'll make and the value of that contribution. And then that in turn affords them a certain amount of status, influence, esteem, and power within the group. And so when we get to so going back to both known information and implicit assumptions, so these aren't necessarily based on like your first encounter with someone or those first impressions, um, but to a certain extent, like these things can change over time. The example that I think of is, let's say you're in a classroom and the first few classes, before your groups are assigned, there's a person in the class who is always one of the first to speak. They always have an answer, they always have something to contribute. But then after a while, you realize that although they're very willing to speak and always have an answer, they may or may not be right. Maybe their answers aren't really as good as you thought, but because of their confidence and their willingness to contribute, you initially afforded them, you had really high performance expectations for them. You assume that, okay, if I'm put in a group with this person, they're going to be a real asset to the group. They're going to provide, you know, a lot of, their contribution is going to be very valuable. And so maybe you assign those groups and you kind of automatically defer to this person and let them lead and make decisions. But then as the semester continues, you figure out that this person is maybe they're just really good at talking. Maybe they haven't really done the readings and their answers aren't as informed by the material as you initially assumed. And so they can change over time, but we're really just talking about how they emerge, not necessarily how they're maintained, but how these status hierarchies emerge within these groups. And so two key points here is when the combination is favorable. So again, those two criteria we use to evaluate. When the combination is favorable, we will have a positive view of a person's ability to contribute to a task, and vice versa. So when the combination is unfavorable, we will have a less positive or even a negative view of a person's ability contribute to a task. And this results in a hierarchy where one's position corresponds to the level of esteem and influence within the group. So you come into a group, you've had a few weeks in class, and you kind of have some judgments about some of the other group members, and based on maybe how they look, the identities that you can recognize, and maybe how they dress or speak, how they engage in class, some of the assumptions you can make about them, you use to make assumptions about how well they're going to perform, the value of their contribution to the group. And that's kind of how these status hierarchies begin to emerge. And so here's an illustration of the formation of performance expectations and status hierarchies. So you'll see the three boxes on the far left. Today, we're really focusing in on those socially significant characteristics. Later on, we'll touch on social rewards and behavioral interchange patterns. But for today, we're just talking about socially significant characteristics and how they contribute to the formation of performance expectations, which then lead to behavioral inequalities and status hierarchies. And so, moving on to status characteristics theory, which focuses on the way certain evaluations or attributes shape interactional behavior. And so, again, status characteristics theory is kind of nested under expectation states theory. But so, again, we're focusing very much on those socially significant characteristics. And that's really what status characteristics theory focuses on. And in past sections, like the one on identity theory and social identity theory, we discussed the cognitive and group processes involved in stereotyping. In this section, however, we will examine the impact of these processes and what they have on interactional behavior. And in contrast to the cognitive and group processes focus on stereotypes, status characteristics theory emphasizes the behavioral manifestations of certain attitudes and evaluations. It says that these differences in evaluations and attitude result in observable differences in interaction. So there are two types of status characteristics that are described by the theory: diffuse and specific. Diffuse status characteristics activate general and specific expectations about performance. And so these are for example, these are differentially valued attributes associated with, and this is just an example, with sex, as well as generalized expectations about which sex will be more or less capable in different situations. And so a few points throughout here, and this is something I'll mention again. But a lot of the research in this area, especially the foundational research, is they really focus on gender. And so a lot of our examples for this section will be based in gender. But I want to be clear that in sociology, at least, there are very clear distinctions between our the way we define and conceptualize gender versus the way we define sex. And so in some places, I'll put in sex because they're specifically talking about like males and females. And so it's kind of conflated. So a lot of the research they've conflated, at least our contemporary ideas of sex and gender. So for the purpose of just communicating this research, I'll often use sex as an example, and that's specifically based in those binary categories of male and female. So I just wanted to point that out. However, like I said, a lot of these examples are based in gender, which is sometimes more similar to our definition of sex, and then sometimes um, more so rooted in our current conceptualization and understanding of gender. So I'll try to make sure that I make those distinctions clear as we move through these different examples. But again, so a diffuse status characteristic, again, it activates general and specific expectations about performance. And so sex is a diffuse status characteristic um, because of each of its states, so male and female. And it's associated with differentially valued attributes, such as males are accorded, for example, like higher mathematical ability, and females are accorded like higher creative writing ability, for example, um, which then lends to specific status characteristics, which generate distinct expectations about specific abilities. So, for example, like mathematical ability, creative writing ability, and so on. And it has the potential to affect the status organizing process in a task related setting if the ability is relevant to the task. And so, one way to remember these is in general, diffuse status characteristics are more so again they can activate general and specific expectations about performance, but it's more so applied to very broad groups. So like sex, gender, race, religion, education, um, it's more so applied to those broad groups. And when you think of all the categories within those groups, so again, going at sex, like male and female, like there's those two categories um, that so broadly there are these general assumptions and then more specific expectations once you break down those different categories and incorporate um, other characteristics. So, and then specific status characteristics. Also, sorry if you hear like different sounds. My roommate's dog insists on sitting next to me right now. So I guess she might help contribute to recording this lecture. Um, but at any rate, so specific status characteristics, again, are very, very specific. So like mathematical ability. So diffuse is tends to be a lot more general. They can be specific, but it's more so applied to those broad categories. Whereas specific is self-explanatory. They're much more specific status characteristics. So moving on to differentiation, and this is something we discussed previously in the beginning of this lecture, is how group members differentiate um, themselves from one another, how each member is made unique in terms of their ability to contribute and the value of their contribution. So status characteristics theories holds that external evaluations of status characteristics will be imported into task related group settings. So in the setting, both diffuse and specific status characteristics become activated or salient when they differentiate members of the group. Differentiation of group members occurs when there are differing states of a status characteristic evident within the group. So, famously, in a lot of the studies, they'll talk about mixed sex groups specifically, or when group members collectively believe that a particular characteristic is relevant to the task. So, as in tasks that are considered to be stereotypically male or female, or tasks that are heavily gendered, considered like more feminine or more masculine. So, when group members collectively believe that a particular characteristic is relevant to the task. So, an example there, and one of so an example there in one of these settings is like if the task at hand is something that is considered like more stereotypically female or feminine, or the expectations of females or women more so coincide with the expectations of that task, um, that might be seen as something that is relevant. So, in like a mixed sex group, the expectations would be different for males and females. And so, even when unrelated to the task, group members will will form expectations and act as if this information is relevant. So, when you have groups of people who, let's say there's a group and pretty much everything about you is extraordinarily similar. There's not a lot of, in terms of, let's say, your skills and ability, you have, the very similar skills and ability. You don't really differ across a lot of these different categories, these different status characteristics. Um, but in order to decide kind of maybe who does what, or who has the most influence or the most status within the group, who's kind of the leader, um, we will draw from these status characteristics the ones that are salient in the moment, whether or not they're really related to the task at all, but salient in terms of, evident to the group. And we'll form expectations based on these things, and act as if that information is relevant, whether or not it has anything to do with someone's ability to complete the task or not. So, moving on to assumptions. So, status characteristics theory seeks to explain how beliefs about status characteristics get translated into performance expectations. And these shape the behaviors of individuals in a group. And so, in other words, it explores the process of attributing specific abilities to individuals based on the status characteristics they possess. And so, it's really focused on how beliefs about status characteristics get translated into performance expectations, which then shape our behavior in a group. So, it's very much focused on that process. So, expectation states theory is interested in how these hierarchies form, but status characteristics theory is kind of goes down on that, I don't know, like a bit of a deeper level. So it's not just how these status hierarchies come to be, but how the beliefs themselves about status characteristics get translated into these performance expectations that in turn shape our behavior. And so, at the heart of the theory, 5 assumptions link beliefs about status to behavior. And so these are the 5 assumptions, and this is something that we're going to cover in depth on Wednesday. And some of this might seem confusing now, but I think it will really help illustrate uh, expectation states theory, how status characteristics theory plays a role. And these 5 assumptions, I think, will really help to clarify that. So that's the salience assumption, the burden of proof assumption, the sequencing assumption, the aggregate assumption, and the comparison assumption. And finally, finally, there's a quote, and I thought it was just um, perfect for this. So, one of the things to note, first and foremost, is the importance of expectation states theory, is that these trends within small groups um, tend to perpetuate themselves over time, resulting um, in some people within these groups having more influence and power than others. Um, and so what this means is that these social status hierarchies, um, and related to these different status characteristics, um, perhaps is translated um, on an institutional level or even on a macro level. But again, the theory focused specifically on how these status hierarchies form in small groups. So that's important to note. Uh, but you can imagine that, what happens in a group, in small groups, and how it's informed by societal expectations and norms, how that can translate across groups and across society. But I thought this quote was perfect for this section. And I have no idea who Brian Tracy is. He's an author and motivational speaker. Um, I don't know if I don't know who he is. And I'm by no means like supporting this quote. I mean, maybe you like it, that's great. Maybe you don't, that's also great. Uh, but it says, become the kind of leader that people would follow voluntarily, even if you had no title or position. And so here in this section, we're talking about these status hierarchies within groups, right? So maybe the top of that is the leader of the group. And whereas, there are other theories that focus on more formal understandings of status and power. So, right, like the relationship between a boss and an employee. The nature of those roles, it's this the status is built in. So your boss, by the nature of being your boss, has a higher status than you do within that group hierarchy. But expectation states theory and status, or I guess expectation states theory more broadly, but also status characteristics theory and some of the other things we're going to discuss, focuses on kind of those more informal status hierarchies within groups. And of course, they can later become formalized, but it's more so focused on these less formal status hierarchies and how individual members of the group, despite not having some sort of formal position or title, are considered leaders of the group. And so this quote, it's supposed to help people become better leaders. It's supposed to, or at least like I think it's part of a book or something that tells people. It seems like a self-help book that tells people how to become better leaders and well respected. But what we learned from expectation states theory is that it's much more complicated than that. It's much more complicated than just portraying a sense of confidence. It's much more complicated than having the skills and ability and the background to contribute to a group. It's also about perception and the people who are part of that group and their perception. So it's about perception, it's about interaction. And so becoming the kind of leader that people would follow voluntarily, even if you had no title or position, it in terms of those like less formal status hierarchies, that's really what expectation states is interested in. Is why is it that some people become leaders in groups over others? How are they leaders in groups despite not having, not being elected or given a formal title? Why are they, maybe the spokesperson for the group or the person who's making all the decisions or the person with the most power to influence others in the group? How is it that this emerges without those more formalized, um, roles and expectations and those formal titles and positions being in place? And so here, for those of you who are just reading the slides or might look over the slides, it's just another explanation of why I chose this quote, and also because I have no idea who Brian Tracy is. But I just thought that quote was just great. So I assume it's maybe not like the best quote for leadership, unless from that perspective you want to kind of going back to impression management and how people perceive you. If you want to kind of cultivate your the way others perceive you based on these different status characteristics, maybe that can help your status position within a group. I don't know. But I'll just go ahead and read it. So again, I have no idea who Brian Tracy is, but I thought this quote was perfect for this section because expectation states theory focuses less on those formal hierarchies and more on those less formal group hierarchies. So, even though someone doesn't hold a formal title or position, they are still held in higher esteem and have more influence within a group. And expectation states theory explores this aspect of group processes. And so, one of the examples I used here was kind of like Regina George. Nobody elected her to be the group's leader, but she is the member with the most status and influence over the group, despite it not being like a formalized position. But other than that, that's all for today. Make sure to go ahead and get started on your activity 5, which is due Friday, and we will pick back up on this section Wednesday. Thanks.